Welcome to another beautiful day in Africa. Behind me, the sun's rising over the valley. Up ahead, I've got some overcast and some beautiful mountains to climb. And it's a perfect day to talk about Canon's new R5 Mark II. I'm going to be looking at some of the key features for wildlife photography as I head up this mountain track. And by the time I reach the top, I want to have decided whether I'm going to upgrade from my current R5 to the R5 Mark II. If you're struggling with some of the same decisions as me, then this video is for you. If you're new to the channel, my name is Will. I followed my heart to Africa 27 years ago to photograph its beautiful wildlife and landscapes. And this channel is about life photographing Africa. Before we jump too deeply into this subject, I think it's important to just put wildlife photography in Africa in a little bit of context. First off, I think a lot of the information on the internet is coming from North America, Europe, and possibly Australia about what cameras to choose and what cameras to buy for wildlife photography. And people, because they shoot a lot of birds over there, tend to talk about wildlife photography and bird photography as if they're the same thing. I'm sorry, but that's just not the case. It doesn't require as much from a camera to photograph a large mammal in Africa as it does to photograph a small bird in flight. So if you're looking at a camera because you're coming on safari, which you might be because you're watching this channel, you don't necessarily need to upgrade to a bleeding edge, sophisticated machine like the R5 Mark II just because you're on safari. I think it's always important to put any camera that we're thinking about buying into its lens ecosystem. And if we think about that from the perspective of something like the Fuji X-H2S, it makes a lot of sense to do this because the only real super telephoto lens we can put on that without adapting from another system is the 150 to 600 f8. There's nowhere else to go. For a great camera, a great wildlife camera, to have no lenses is a problem. And Canon, to some degree, is in the same boat. We've obviously got the super expensive RF primes, and we've also got the older EF lenses, which we can still adapt, which saves Canon to some degree. But after the primes, and in the middle, we've just got a raft of enthusiast lenses. We've got lenses like the 600 f11, the 800 f11, the 200 to 800 f9, if we can find one even for sale, and then we've got the excellent 100 to 500 f7.1. But in reality, for Africa, the 500 f7.1 is a little bit short, to be honest. Particularly when you're shooting from a vehicle. It also has a difficult relationship with teleconverters, not being able to zoom out past 300. When we think about it from Nikon's perspective, things get a lot better because they've got a wonderful internal zooming 180 to 600 f6.3, a faster lens. They've got obviously the same sort of super telephoto primes, but this time with built-in teleconverters, which is a really nice option to have. And then they've got a middle ground. They've got an 800 f6.3 PF and a 600 f6.3 PF, which we can buy for much less money than the super telephotos, but still offer you a slightly more professional option than the 180 to 600. So we're talking about a lens ecosystem that really works. They've also got the ability to adapt Canon lenses successfully to their mount using a third-party adapter from Fringer, and they've also got the ability to adapt Sony lenses to their mount. That is a lot of versatility. And we shouldn't forget that Nikon has allowed third-party lens manufacturers to also use the Z mounts. I think Nikon actually has the edge over the R5 Mark II and Canon at the moment. Alright, so what about the people like me who are trapped in the RF system? They've got a lot of lenses, they've got other cameras, and to some degree it's difficult to move away from Canon. Well then I think the R5 Mark II does actually make a lot more sense because it is an upgrade. But how much of one really? And to gauge that, I think we need some sort of framework. What's important in the camera for wildlife photographers? And I think for me, after lenses comes autofocus. And that's because I do photograph small, fast-moving birds in flight as well as mammals out here in Africa. The autofocus system on the R5 Mark II is probably going to be a significant step above the R5 as it borrows the system from the R1, which is a good sign. It also has a faster sensor readout speed, which is a good sign because it means it can react more quickly to changes in focus. And it has a separate digic accelerator chip, specifically AI-enabled for autofocus. It's AI enabled for things like volleyball, football, that's soccer in America, and basketball, which are subjects that I am absolutely never going to shoot. But if some of those optimizations are actually for wildlife and birds in flight, and if some of them come via firmware later, then I'm definitely interested. Another new feature on the R5 Mark II is eye control autofocus, a feature that first came out on the Canon R3. Now, it's meant to be an updated version of that, so maybe that takes it beyond the realm of gimmickry, and I'm hopeful that it will be useful in a situation where I'm photographing African wildlife, where the eye AF historically for me has not worked very well. It tends to latch on to the tips of horns, the end of tails, hooves, any kind of dark markings on the animal, nostrils particularly. For bird photos though, it works very well. So I've actually got it set up with spot autofocus on one button and eye autofocus on another back button, and I'm able to just shift between the two with my thumb. The other area that it might improve is with this eye control AF. Let's say we've got a bird like an oxpecker sitting on the back of something like a buffalo. What animal do you want to photograph at any particular time? If you can tell it to go to the oxpecker when the oxpecker is doing something interesting with your eye, and back to the buffalo's eye when it's not, that would be an amazing win for the R5 Mark II over the R5. The next thing on my checklist of things I need from a wildlife camera is frames per second. The R5 Mark II now offers 30 frames per second on a 45 megapixel sensor, which is sensational, and it does so with a lower readout speed and therefore less rolling shutter. And that's not just important for still photography, but also for videography. Obviously, with those frames per second comes pressure on buffer, and buffer is going to be possibly an issue with this camera because it has one CF Express Type B card, and it's a version 2 of that card, not a version 4. And it also has an SD card. The SD card is a little bit of an issue because it's much slower than the CF Express Type B. And if you're shooting two shots, so a backup shot to the SD card, you might have a problem when it becomes time to clear the buffer out. It's not going to be as quick at doing that. For me, I don't need to shoot two shots. I'm not an event or a wedding photographer that needs a backup. I can shoot one shot, I'll shoot it to the CF Express Type B card, and that means my buffer should clear out a little bit more quickly than if I was to shoot to both cards. The problem with shooting 30 frames per second is it fills up the buffer more quickly. So there has been an improvement in the buffer. It's bigger than it was before, but it fills up in roughly the same amount of time as the current R5. So if you're commonly someone who always shoots to the buffer, you'll get more photographs in that buffer period, but you won't get more time in that buffer period. I'm speculating a little here as to why Canon didn't include two CF Express Type B cards, but I can see why they might not. So obviously price is one reason, but possibly heat is another. And given the fanfare over the R5, the original R5's release with the overheating issue, Canon definitely doesn't want to repeat that. So there are some other improvements that might help dissipate heat. There's some design improvements internally to the camera, but there's also vents. And those vents are going to help dissipate the heat, both in stills and movie shooting mode. And I think that's really important. It's not in my framework for wildlife photography, but it definitely is in my framework for video and wildlife hybrid shooting. Overheating has been a problem for me in the past, particularly when you're looking at a sighting like a lion or a leopard for a long period of time waiting for the action, and you're looking through that viewfinder. What happens is, even though you're just looking through the viewfinder and not taking photographs, it's still heating up the camera. And when it comes time to actually flip over into video mode, the camera is generally overheated, especially in a hot African environment. So those cooling vents, the lack of the CF Express Type B might actually be an advantage in respect of heat. The next most important aspect of camera in my framework is usually the sensor. And here, the Canon R5 Mark II also has an advantage over the existing R5. They're both 45 megapixels, the same resolution, but the new camera has a backside illuminated stacked sensor. And the important thing about that is the readout speed. Now, that readout speed probably comes at a cost. Petapixel a few days ago published some tests where they found that the existing R5 has better dynamic range than the R5 Mark II. That means the shadow detail in the R5 appears to be better than on the new sensor. But that's kind of to be expected because the new sensor performs so much faster than the old one. The new sensor has a readout speed of around 6.2 milliseconds, the old one about 16.3. However, if you're a landscape photographer, you're not going to be that thrilled about that loss in dynamic range. It's going to be worse, potentially, than the existing camera. Therefore, why the upgrade? You don't need the frames per second. That's a downside. The other issue that we've got for wildlife, though, is that the R5 Mark II includes a low-pass filter. I'm pretty sure the old R5 did as well, so there's not much difference there. That low-pass filter is going to render a little less detail for wildlife subjects like birds feather detail, and for landscapes. But it is going to help those portrait and fashion photographers deal with effects caused by clothing. So it's a general camera, it seems. Now, one of the big advantages over the previous camera is in electronic shutter mode. Previously, when we used electronic shutter, we were limited to 12-bit photographs, raw files. Now, we get 14-bit raw files. So we should be able to pull out a little bit more detail from those files, especially color detail from those files than we were able to before. If we wanted 14-bit in the past with the R5, we'd have to shoot it in the mechanical shutter mode. Another area where the sensor improves over the previous version is in the metering and white balance. Previously, we had 384 metering zones on the R5. It's gone up to 6,144 on the R5 Mark II. A marked difference. How much of a difference in reality? I'm not certain. But one thing I will note is that on most Canon cameras to date, there is no metering, under the AF point. So if you move that autofocus point off the center and around the screen and you use spot metering, it actually isn't metering under the AF point where you think it might be. It's metering from the middle of the photograph. And that's always been an issue for many sort of mid-range Canon cameras. It's only been the top-end cameras that have been able to produce metering under an AF point, unlike most top-end Nikon cameras, which have been able to do metering under the AF point. And for a long time too, back into the era of DSLRs. So if this new metering system allows for spot metering under the AF point, I think that's a marked shift in favor of the R5 Mark II. So I think it's clear that on the basis of our framework, the Canon R5 Mark II is a significant improvement over the existing R5. But it has more features that I haven't included in the framework. And one of the most exciting of these is pre-capture, both in video and in photos. Canon's included a half-second pre-capture before you press the button. And that means things like takeoff shots have just become far, far easier than they were. The implementation, though, is still a little clunky. They've got rid of that container file that we know and love from the Canon R7. Now they're individually saved to the SD card, which will be a welcome relief to most people. But there's still half a second when you press the shutter button, and that's 15 shots on the Canon R5 Mark II. That's a lot of extra work for most photographers to go through and select the right shots. And so I guess another of the improvements comes into play here, and that's the ability in metadata to tag sharp shots. So if we've got all of these extra shots from pre-capture, hopefully this metadata tag that we'll be able to see in Canon DPP and hopefully in other software later will show us which ones we want to keep much more quickly and allow us to delete the dross. One thing that I've always loved about Canon cameras is the longevity of the design. The button layouts on these things very rarely change across models, and the R5 Mark II is really no different. The major changes are just the inclusion of a video toggle on-off switch on the left side, which people were crying out for some reason I can't fathom, and the on-off switch over here on the right side of the body. The reason people were complaining about the video switch is because they had to press the mode dial and then the info button on the back of the camera to change into video mode and make a selection. So it was sort of 2 button presses, and apparently that wasn't good enough, despite the fact that it was on the right side of the body for holding the camera. I didn't have a problem with it whatsoever, and I now have a problem with the Canon R5 Mark II. Is when you're holding a large telephoto lens like this, your left hand is usually here focusing, using the zoom, or supporting the lens. Most of the time I'm shooting a 400mm f2.8, which is a 3.5 kilo lens, and I can't just drop my hand off it and toggle the button like this to shoot video. So if I'm transitioning from photographs, I have to lose contact with the subject, look away from the subject, toggle the button, look back, try and find the subject again to shoot video. It is going to make a practical difference to getting shots that I am able to get with this camera. Now I'm very, very hopeful that this button here, the record button, is still present on the R5 Mark II and still functions in the same way, where you can press it and it automatically goes into the C3, the custom mode 3 video shooting mode. Another improvement is the inclusion or the inheritance of the R3's EVF. It's said to be brighter and also now to include blackout-free shooting. The problem with including all of these extras in the newer camera is that Canon's had to upgrade the capacity of the battery. We now have a new battery, the LPE6P, that's more powerful than the old one, and Canon says the old one won't support some of the functions in the new camera. And that makes a lot of sense. This battery, this form factor of battery, goes back years and years and years. The consequence of that, though, is that a lot of us Canon shooters have collected these batteries over time and expected to be able to use them in newer models. There has been a history of upgrades to this form factor of battery, and it shouldn't really be a surprise to us. The difficulty is that we're going to lose some of the feature set of the camera. We've got all of these old batteries, and the chances are we're going to have to fork out quite a bit of extra money for the new batteries. Safari vehicles don't have charging points in them, and if you're out for a whole day shooting a lot of photographs and a lot of video, and you're sitting and watching wildlife through the optical viewfinder, it really discharges the batteries quickly. If I go on the current price of the current battery for the R5, it's $155 in South Africa, and that, I'm afraid, is quite a steep hill to climb. Canon has introduced no less than 3 new versions of a grip for the Canon R5 Mark II. Sadly, the older grip no longer works, or rather, it does work, it just doesn't work with the new batteries. So you can use it with the older batteries inside, but some of those features that we want with the new camera won't work with those batteries. The new grips, however, all include 2 batteries. One of the grips is a networking grip, which I don't think many of us are going to be that interested in. The second grip is a cooling grip with a built-in fan. It still includes 2 batteries, but it doesn't include the vertical controls on the back. And the third is a traditional grip that most of us will be familiar with. The existing grip is said to work with the camera. The difficulty is the batteries will not be powering all of the functionality. Specifically, the features that won't work with the older battery inserted into the camera are the network connectivity, the Wi-Fi and wired LAN. It reduces continuous shooting speed and prevents selection of 8K. Any frame rate above 25 HDMI raw output is no longer working, and still shooting during movie recording, as well as high frame rate movies and pre-continuous shooting are not available. If you can live without that, we can use the old batteries. I suspect this fence is here to prevent European buyers of the Canon R5 Mark II from jumping over the cliff when they hear the price. In the UK at least, it's £4,500, roughly $5,720. In South Africa, with our sales tax included, it's around $4,800. In the US, $4,300, but you have different sales taxes over there that you need to apply. That's about $400 more than the original R5. So I guess it is a bit of an upgrade, but is it worth $5,720 to get it in Europe? All right, let's push through this fence, go down to the cliff, and sum up whether we're actually going to buy this camera or not. Here guys, that there is the clearest sign of animal intelligence I've ever seen. That is a baboon turd. Some baboon has been sitting up here, having a shit, and admiring this spectacular view. And who could blame him? I certainly can't. I'm not that comfortable standing with a 1,000-meter drop right behind me, discussing the relative merits of the R5 Mark II, so I better make this snappy. There's a few things that we haven't talked about yet, because they're not so relevant to wildlife photography. One of them that you might be interested in is the image upscaling in camera, and also the image denoising in camera. I don't know exactly who that's for, possibly events or something like that. Other than that, the R5 has a few cons. The cost of the new grips and the new batteries, the cost of the camera itself is pretty sharp, especially if you're in Europe. And another downside is lack of GPS. I would have liked to see that brought back for a wildlife camera. A further downside that we've already talked about is the lower dynamic range over the existing R5, and I'm not sure if a lot of people who don't need high frame rates are happy about that. I think if I was shooting still lifes, landscapes, I think the R5, the original one, provides a better option actually. For video shooters, the R5 Mark II includes C-Log 2. That's a big bonus. I'm not sure anybody I'm certainly not interested in 8K. It's just far too much storage for me. I'll be only shooting 4K, but I do appreciate the 4K 120 with sound now. That's quite a nice add-on too. So the camera's looking pretty good, especially in comparison to the older R5. It looks pretty good in comparison to the Z8 as well. The Z8 has the advantage of being cheaper, especially a lot cheaper second-hand. It's also available now, and the R5 has a production waitlist. Yes, we might not get it for a long time. The other thing about the Nikon cameras is it has, in my opinion, a better selection of lenses right this minute. And those lenses are available, unlike the 200 to 800 that I'd ordered and paid for to pair with the R5. So, for me, am I going to get this camera? Well, I'm not so sure. I think the existing R5 is a very, very compelling bargain at the moment. I do need a third camera, and it's a lot cheaper because people are dumping them at the moment in order to upgrade, and it's a very, very compelling choice, and it serves 95–96% of my use cases absolutely perfectly. So it's a case of want versus need. I want the R5 Mark II, but I don't necessarily need it. In fact, I definitely don't need it. I'd have got a deposit down on one though. You know, FOMO, hey? I'm on the wait list. And another reason that I feel that I should get it is because I shoot on YouTube, and I've got the possibility of making content about it for you guys and for my channel, which will help my channel to grow. So there's that. Anyway, I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you out there.